Omar, really great to have you with me on stage here. I've addressed the elephant in the room, so I don't necessarily need to kick that off with you now, but I know that there's three areas that you want to cover for the industry at the moment. What's going on, why does it matter, and what should executives do? Now, again, I'm going to go into this perhaps with a little bit more sensationalist phrase, but when we were talking before this panel, I asked you whether incumbent telcos are at risk of the process known as creative destruction and perhaps obliteration if they don't change fast. You had a different phrase for it.
Yeah, I mean, obliteration's a big word. Actually, when you look at disruption, and we've looked at it a lot, in fact, we studied 3,600 companies, you find that the famous cases of companies or industries completely going away because of disruption are actually quite rare. Mm-hmm. Much more common is what we call compressive disruption, where the profit streams of companies become squeezed over time, typically playing out over a 20 to 30-year period, where investment capacity of a company is reduced. And that's a giant problem because it actually feels normal. It feels normal because all the other management teams in the sector feel the same pressure caused by the same forces. And what then becomes difficult is to renew yourself when you need to. And it's fueled essentially by modern innovation. So there's a huge amount of technology-powered innovation that's happening in the world, not just in Silicon Valley, but in Shenzhen and around the world. And what we find actually is that the potential value creation from that modern innovation is increasing. And the actual value creation that companies take from innovation is increasing much slower. So actually there's a kind of a potential energy and a gap emerging that actually creates the risk for compressive disruption for companies.
And that's trapped value.
And we call that trapped value, indeed, yeah. And if you look at you're asking specifically about telcos, I mean, there are a lot of things that are not news to this audience, but the macro environment is complicated. Mm-hmm. You mentioned the strategic arms race around technology, which is beyond telco. It's a bigger game. In the industry, you have challenger telcos. I mean, the Jio example in India is unbelievable. I think Rakuten in Japan are going to be proposing a range of 4G and 5G networks without having to bother going via the other generations. And so this kind of challenger brand in asset-intensive industries is somewhat new, but we're seeing that. Everyone in the room knows about the OTT players and the digital providers who are happy to ride on the investments of others and deliver services and be close to customers. And then in the industry itself, there's a whole reconfiguration of assets that we call convergence, but actually, more content, less content, in the exact form, it's not 100% clear. So you've got a macro environment that is complex. You have an industry environment that is complex. And then on top of that, you have technology. And so we could talk about IoT and cloud and security and artificial intelligence and, of course, 5G itself. Mm-hmm. And mastering all of that at once is a bit of a complicated task for the modern-day CEO. So yeah. Those are the things that feed into where compressive disruption can come from.
Now, 5G and the things that it enables, you mentioned some of them there, IoT, of course, autonomous driving, automated factories, homes, etc., as well as faster download speeds for consumers. How can telecom companies get over the challenge of investing in 5G when nobody quite knows which of those areas is going to be most profitable in the long term?
Yeah, I do think that's a super tricky question. And I don't want for 1 second to pretend I have the answer. But there are glimpses of the answer from across industry. So one thing is telcos, what we do know is to get to the benefit of 5G is going to take a monster level of investment. In fact, in every industry, getting to the new space typically takes a big investment. So whether we're talking about spectrum or the actual network itself, I mean, there's just a lot of money to spend. And so the question is, how do you fuel that in a world where we're too accustomed talking about EBITDA and therefore ignoring the depreciation element and ignoring the fact that the cash flows and the net income flowing to the bottom are not big enough. You have, again, this is well understood with the CEOs, you have mid-single-digit returns on capital in a high single-digit weighted average cost of capital environment, which is upside down. So investors obviously rightly skeptical to say, well, hey, you're going to spend all this money and who's going to monetize it? So therefore, companies need to massively digitize the current operation to drive down costs and maximize investment capacity. Because actually you need that as a fuel for the investments in the new. So that's the first part, is this big investment in digital to digitize the enterprise today. Secondly, and I think we talk a lot about ARPUs and not enough about net promoter scores and experience. And so the question is, how can I, in today's business, just deliver a better service to customers so that they're more engaged with my brand and with me? And that's a whole topic. And then thirdly, on your question, because product market fit is basically impossible to predict. I mean, this is Omar from Accenture saying this. The only way you can do it is run real-world experiments. And so if you believe that the new world is expensive and that the current financial constraints are tight, then that tells you that A, you need to partner heavily, and where combinations of companies come together where they partner around the investments they've made to create new solutions. And B, it tells you that you have to be really good at experimenting with modern innovation, with real customers, to see what will work. So is it that mass IoT thing? Is it that ultra-low latency thing? Is it the fixed wireless thing? I mean, there are a whole series of services that the industry know about, and whether it's the cool immersive reality things around sports stadia, or whether it's real-time healthcare for surgery, I mean, they will all happen, but exactly how much money you spend and when is the crux issue. And the only way to solve that is through experimentation for real.
And is that experimentation happening enough in the industry, in your view, at the moment?
I think the answer to that varies, obviously, completely on who you're talking to and the environment you're in. I mean, I've said this to some of my clients in Europe, is I feel in Europe we talk too much about cost, and it's not enough. I mean, of course, you have to be super cost effective as a company. Back to what I said earlier, is that if my core operation is not delivering cash flow from operations, then I won't earn the right to invest in these new things. But if I only talk about cost, we know where that movie ends as well. Companies that are ex-growth don't do well in the long run. And that's that. In the US, I think it is different. There is more appetite for some levels of experimentation, and there are some good examples out there that companies are playing with. And then again, if I go around different parts of the world, some telcos are working much harder to say, hey, we're sitting at a control point here of a lot of consumer data. How do I have a role in the digital marketing and digital advertising space and not just leave that to others? And if I have visibility of a lot of traffic on networks, how can I have a role in cybersecurity that others might be playing? So I think there are some interesting plays out there, but I honestly think we're very early, actually. We're very early in that journey today.
Why is Europe the laggard, I could say, when it comes to 5G versus the rest of the world? I ask because we're sitting here. Is it because European telcos are much more focused on costs, or is it something else as well?
So I don't want to throw any rocks because, again, I'm not pretending I have the answers. But in Europe, the market is more fragmented. The digital market is more fragmented. So we have a European single market for goods and services, but not for digital services. And yes, there have been some moves from the Commission to address some of that. But again, that's pretty early days. And there are some very different opinions in the Commission between the role of competition and the role of, let me say, state encouragement of enterprise. And so Europe looks like in a different position on that equation relative to, say, China or the US today. And so you have that as a commercial regulatory framework that's different. And then you have the scale issue. In some places you have giant companies, and other places you have much smaller companies. And of course the capital formation capacity that you have in a smaller company is less than in a very big one. The number of experiments you can run are less. The leverage you have over your suppliers are less. The investment in innovation you can make will be less. And so all of those things play, and it becomes a question of, well, what do your policymakers care about? And are they thinking about unit costs of prices on yesterday's products or services, or are they thinking about what the future can bring? And I think there's a whole lot of choices there that one needs to get into.
Look, with talking about a fragmented market, you've naturally led me to a question that I feel I always ask when it comes to telecoms, so I'm going to ask it nonetheless. Is consolidation the answer?
Well, I mean, in Europe, as you know, there are already some consolidation moves afoot. And sometimes scale is really important. It turns out that in asset-intensive industries like people who build networks, scale is super important. So if someone said to me, what would help Europe accelerate? I mean, sometimes allowing some scale in is important, but not at the expense of competition either. So you don't want to go to a total oligopoly or duopoly or something like that, because you need that competitive edge. But yeah, scale can be very helpful.
What about diversification as well and moving into areas such as cyber security? I know there are examples of companies around the world who've done this and done it very successfully. Is that a viable route for a lot of the clients that you work with?
I make a joke inside Accenture sometimes that when I grew up in business, all the telcos had one strategy, which was build a pipe. And there was a debate about how fat the pipe was and how permeated it was and so on, but it was basically build a pipe. Today, they really are on different strategies across the world, and it's not totally clear which ones will win. But I think the basic rules of business are still intact, which is if you're close to your customers and if you're relevant to your customers, not because you're advocating your brand via advertising, but because you deliver amazing experiences, then you can be successful. That, of course, applies. I mean, in a cybersecurity domain, the big challenge there is as the world moves from putting all of computing in a data center to spreading it out across a private cloud and a public cloud and an edge computing device, the security envelope becomes much bigger. The world is much more complex. So if you're solving the bigger complex problems, then of course customers will find that very relevant. If we go after individual little tiny point bits of the puzzle, then I think less so. So it depends exactly on what you're trying to achieve.
As you keep bringing up customers, I start to think about competition from the likes of Google, Amazon, Facebook, Microsoft. How can telcos best collaborate with the likes of these giants rather than trying to compete with them?
Yeah, I think those companies that you mentioned, I mean, obviously they're not all the same and they have different strengths. More or less, they're all now beginning to orient towards the enterprise as an area that they want to service. I mean, Microsoft obviously been there for a much longer time. So of course, they're very open, I think, to collaboration. But what we find in this space is that sometimes you have to be clear about where am I going to be competing? Where am I serving each other? Because you can have services each way. And other times I'm going to market together around a set of services. And I think the world is moving more in that direction. But that does take the formation of new skills, which is I'm not the master of everything, where I have all the innovation in-house. I have to be willing to share and partner. The way in which I contract needs to be more flexible or more nimble. I need to be clear about things like who actually owns the data and the rights around the data and who's got what intellectual property. And those are new conversations that I think a lot of companies are getting into. And I'm certain we'll see a lot more of that actually this week and beyond Mobile World Congress.
So let's just briefly sum up for everybody then. You've talked about the issue being compressive disruption. Why does it matter? And just your top 3 things for what CEOs and other people at telcos can do from here.
I mean, in terms of why it matters, compressive disruption is obviously if a company is squeezed, even if a management team sort of serves its time and does well and leaves, the legacy of the company will be jeopardized. And when you see that 50% of companies since the year 2000 have basically left the Fortune 500, it's something to think about. And I think most CEOs that I know want to leave something sustainable, not a short-term thing. So if you look at the market cap increase in telcos across the last 5 years and compare it, say, to the big software and platform companies you mentioned, it's a 10x difference. And that tells you everything, because investors are not expecting the future to be as rosy as it should be. So I think that's why it matters. Now, in terms of what to do, 1 is digitize the enterprise to drive down costs and increase investment capacity. 2 is think about customers and customer experiences and not ARPUs. And that means much more flexible commercial engagements with customers. It means web self-service apps that work. And it means apps that just make sense to deal with. And thirdly, the B2B space is a huge opportunity for telcos. And moving customers away from a choice of either old-style managed services or having to integrate some amazing complexity themselves to bringing prepackaged solutions, working with these ecosystem partners like the Googles and the Microsofts and the Amazons, and bringing a new proposition to them is, I think, a way to go.
Thank you so much. Omar Abbosh, Group CEO for Accenture, Comms, Media and Tech. Thank you so much.